For this online lesson, we're going to learn a little bit about the limbic system in the brain. The limbic system has some basic general functions, as you can see here. Motivation, and what we mean by that is what are we motivated to do? To eat, to reproduce, and to protect ourselves, so the fight or flight response. It can also be important in emotion, and we're going to see it's linked up with that in this chapter as well as later in the term when we talk about the chapter on emotion and the chapter on stress. And as you might guess, these motivations would be important in learning and memory. We want to learn and remember where the food is. We want to learn and remember where the pretty girls are. We want to learn and remember where the scary stuff is so we can avoid it in the future. Here is a diagram that illustrates the location of several structures associated with the limbic system, as well as other structures in the brain so that you know its relative location. You should be familiar with a number of these structures and be able to label a number of these structures on a diagram for our midterm exam. Some of the structures in the limbic system include the hippocampus, which is important for learning and memory, the amygdala, which is important for emotion, and the fornix, which connects the hippocampus to the mammillary bodies of the hypothalamus. And last but not least, the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, you want to think about this, is important for those motivating factors. The 4 F's is the good mnemonic device: feeding, fighting, fleeing, fornicating. The hypothalamus does a number of other things, including regulating the autonomic nervous system, or the ANS for short. And it also has control of the pituitary gland, which is our master gland that has a lot to do with the hormones in our system. So the hypothalamus releases releasing hormones, for example, gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which is going to then cause the pituitary to release gonadotropic hormones, which stimulate the gonads, the ovaries and testes at a distal site, to release sex hormones. So you can see that the structures in the limbic system run the gamut. We deal with some really basic aspects of the system as well as the emotional system, and certainly very complex systems as well. And we're going to see this again and again when we talk about stress, when we talk about learning and memory, when we talk about emotion. So the hypothalamus and the limbic system are going to be very important structures throughout the course of this term. Just briefly, I want to mention the pituitary gland. Again, this is your master gland. There's the anterior pituitary, which releases hormones such as prolactin, which sort of sounds like what its name indicates, prolactation. It's going to help to ejaculate the milk for a mother who's breastfeeding, as well as growth hormone. The posterior pituitary is going to release oxytocin, which is important for muscle contractions, in particular uterine contractions during childbirth, but has also been implicated in attachment. Not only attachment of the mother to the child, which would make sense given the intense contractions that occur in labor, but also is released when we have sex with somebody and have the orgasm, which is muscle contractions. A little bit less intense than labor pains, but certainly would encourage attachment to our partners. Another posterior pituitary hormone is vasopressin, which is going to be important in water regulation and is going to talk to our kidneys. This is a diagram from your textbook that you should just be familiar with. You won't have to label anything in particular from this diagram, but again, get an idea of thinking about, well, where are these things being released? And again, remembering that we're dealing with secretory cells when we're talking about the endocrine system, and that these are being released into the blood and often acting at sites very distal to where they're being released. This is what differentiates the endocrine system from the neurotransmitter system. Neurotransmitters typically act very close to where they're being released, where hormones and hormone-releasing factors often act on sites very far away. As you can see, if you're releasing something from the pituitary gland that's going to act all the way down on your ovaries or your testes, it's going to travel quite a distance to exert its effects. Another aspect of the limbic system, and in particular what the hypothalamus does, is to help to control the autonomic nervous system. You might remember from intro psych that the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, or the ANS, is the fight or flight response. The parasympathetic, on the flip side, is your rest and digest. So it's going to help you to relax. And it makes sense. If you're going to have a branch of this system that's going to activate or arouse you, then you need a branch that's going to bring you back to normal. The sympathetic branch is going to do things like dilate your pupils, inhibit the flow of saliva, which is sometimes when you're stressed out, you get a dry mouth. It's going to accelerate the heartbeat, and it's going to shift the blood and oxygen to your muscles, so in case you have to fight off that bear that jumps out at you in the woods or run away. It's also going to inhibit bladder contraction. On the flip side, that bear looks at you and goes, walks away. Now, you're going to stimulate saliva again, slow the heart rate down, shift the blood to the stomach and away from the muscles so you can digest your sandwich, and again, it'll give you control over your bladder again. One other component that I want to mention is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. This is a complex interaction of the central and peripheral nervous systems as well as the endocrine system to modulate our behavior. So it's going to be important in that fight or flight response, in the stress response, both an acute or short-term stress response as well as the long-term stress response, and in our basic emotions. We're going to see the HPA axis a number of times throughout the course, so you do want to be familiar with how it interacts to regulate a lot of these behaviors. And here in this diagram, we can see one way in which the HPA axis functions. So you have the hypothalamus that is releasing corticotropin releasing a releasing hormone, which is what the hypothalamus does, to talk to, in this case, the anterior pituitary gland, which is going to release corticotropic hormone, which is going to stimulate the adrenal cortex to release a stress hormone known as cortisol. And then that cortisol is going to go back in a negative feedback loop to talk to the anterior pituitary as well as the hypothalamus. So this is just one example of that HPA axis and how it's going to interact to give us apart our stress response, which is going to be important again in that fight or flight response, as well as a basic level of our emotions, because certainly stress underlies a lot of our emotional responses.